I'm hoping to get through all of Jehu tonight and at least start Hezekiah. We'll do Hezekiah into next week and maybe get through Manasseh as well. Manasseh is a fairly short study, comparatively speaking. And then we'll do Josiah, and that'll be Dr. Pope will be teaching Josiah when he's on, that'll be the week of May 8th. The following week, Keegan's going to be teaching on the fall of the house of Israel, and then we've got 2 classes allotted for the fall of the house of Judah. And that's it. So we've got 5 more classes here, including tonight. Did I say that right? Yeah, including tonight. 2 Kings chapter 9, verses 30 through 37. When Jehu came to Jezreel, Jezebel heard of it, and she painted her eyes and adorned her head and looked out of the window. And as Jehu entered the gate, she said, "Is it peace, you Zimri, murderer of your master?" And he lifted up his face in the window and said, "Who is on my side?" "Who?" 2 or 3 eunuchs looked out at him, and he said, "Throw her down." So they threw her down. And some of her blood spattered on the wall and on the horses, and they trampled on her. Then he went in and ate and drank. And he said, "See now to this cursed woman, and bury her, for she is a king's daughter." But when they went to bury her, they found no more of her than the skull and the feet and the palms of her hands. And when they came back and told him, he said, "This is the word of the Lord, which he spoke by his servant Elijah the Tishbite. In the territory of Jezreel the dogs shall eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the corpse of Jezebel shall be as dung on the face of the field in the territory of Jezreel, so that no one can say, 'This is Jezebel.'" Now, there's a slightly different, a couple of different translations in verse 33. After she's been thrown down, it says, he rode over her with the chariot. So it's not just that they trampled on her, it's that Jehu actually drove over her after she'd been thrown down. What's the significance of Jezebel painting her eyes and adorning her head? Okay. She could be attempting to intimidate him with royalty, could maybe an attempt to appeal to him. I feel like she kind of ruins that when she opens her mouth, because she immediately says, "Do you come in peace, Zimri, killer of your master?" Now, who was Zimri? Do you remember him? Yeah, ruler for all of 7 days, burned the palace down around himself. That was kind of his claim to fame. For a guy who lasted all of 7 days, he made an impression, apparently, because he's still remembered 2 generations later. So, excuse me, there's Zimri again. So he's infamous. And he's something that evil Canaanite queens sneer about in later days. So I guess you have to be pretty bad if even the Canaanites are like, "Hey, remember Zimri?" In what appears to be an ongoing theme for Jehu, he just ignores Jezebel and speaks to the people who are not in favor of the queen. So what's the significance of the eunuchs throwing her down? Why are they on Jehu's side? I don't think she was very well liked either, so it's entirely possible that they recognize her wickedness. Now, and along those lines, let's consider this. Did the Jews practice castration? Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verse 1 seems to forbid the practice, right? Talks about people not being able to enter the assembly. So that wasn't a Jewish practice, which implies that if she had Jewish eunuchs, that it was done not according to Jewish custom, but according to Canaanite custom. If these are Jews and they've been subjected to this pagan practice, it's entirely possible that they were not happy about that they were not happy with her or the other things that she had brought in, including Baal worship. And so Jehu finds some allies in these eunuchs. What do verses 33 and 34 say about Jehu? What are some implications about his character? Okay, in verses 36 and 37, we see that. He remembers the exact words of the prophet with regards to Jezebel. Let's back up a step to verse 33 and 34, where he kind of has this. Go ahead, Rachel.
I just was going to say, Jehu is a great warrior. I think Jehu loves battle. That's what he's good at. He's good at fighting and taking, I mean, not vengeance, but he's just good as a warrior. And this, I think, comes out in how he has handled all of the people he's met.
Every portrayal we see of Jehu portrays him as a violent man, including the characterizing the way he drives. Right, he drives like a madman. Um, all of these things put together paint a picture of a very violent man, in spite of the fact that he is this person who remembers God's words and listens to them, and then goes on to enact them. He's a man of bloodshed. That seems to be his mode of operation every time we see him. There's a bit of a almost callousness to him, right? They throw Jezebel down, and he just rides the chariot right over her. No big deal. Goes in, eats and drinks. Then he goes and says, "You know what? Let's go mop this mess up." All right. If we move on to 2 Kings chapter 10, we have the slaughter of Ahab's descendants. And in verses 2 and 3, we get a little bit more insight into Jehu's character. Ahab had 70 sons in Samaria, and Jehu writes letters and sends them to Samaria, to the rulers of the city, and says, "Now then, as soon as this letter comes to you, seeing your master's sons are with you, and you have chariots and horses, fortified cities, and weapons, select the best and fittest of your master's sons, set him on his father's throne, and fight for your master's house." Again, he's a little bloodthirsty here, isn't he? He doesn't just want them to roll over. He says, put up a fight. Yeah, he says, there's a throne, put your best guy on it, and we're going to fight over it. He's a man of violence, and he's going to carry this out as violently as possible. But they were exceedingly afraid and said, "Behold, the two kings could not stand before him. How can then we stand?" So he who was over the palace and he who was over the city, together with the elders and the guardians, sent to Jehu, saying, "We are your servants. We will do all you tell us. We will not make anyone king. Do whatever is good in your eyes." Then he wrote them a second letter, saying, "If you're on my side and ready to obey me, take the heads of your master's sons and come to me at Jezreel tomorrow at this time." Now the king's sons, 70 persons, were with the great men of the city who were bringing them up. And as soon as the letter came to them, they took the king's sons and slaughtered them, 70 persons, and put their heads in baskets and sent them to him at Jezreel. And when the messenger came and told him, "They have brought the heads of the king's sons," he said, "Lay them in 2 heaps at the entrance of the gate until morning." Where did Jehu get the practice? So what it says heaps in the ESV. What he's actually saying is build them up in like 2 pyramids. Stack them up in 2 pyramids. Where did he get that practice? Yeah, that's the Assyrians. The Assyrians had this practice when they would go into a nation and encounter resistance. The first city that they capture, they kill everybody and take their heads, and they make a pyramid of them outside the next city. And they say, "Open the gates, or this is you." A violent people that Jehu has chosen to emulate here with Ahab's descendants. Then in the morning, when he went out, he stood and said to all the people, "You're innocent. It was I who conspired against my master and killed him. But who struck down all these? Know then that there shall fall to the earth nothing of the word of the Lord, which the Lord spoke concerning the house of Ahab. For the Lord has done what he said by his servant Elijah." So Jehu struck down all who remained of the house of Ahab in Jezreel, all his great men and his close friends and his priests, until he left none remaining. Again, he's an interesting guy here. As soon as we hear about him being very violent and using the practice of the Assyrians, he contrasts that by turning around and saying, nothing that the Lord spoke is going to fall to the ground. It's all going to come to pass. This is all just what God promised. Go ahead, Kyle. That's right.
Assyria was known for creating images on their library at Nineveh of just these things: pyramids of heads. They would walk the king through the street with a ring in his nose and a chain in the ring. Anybody they conquered, that was the kind of people they were. The library at Nineveh.
I've got a slide here. This is Jehu's submission to Shalmaneser III of Assyria, and it's a stele inscribed, "The tribute of Jehu, son of Omri, I received from him silver, gold, a golden bowl, a golden vase with pointed bottom, golden tumblers, golden buckets, tin, and a staff for king, and spears." So Jehu paid tribute to one of the Assyrian kings and was under him for part of his reign at least. So yeah, the Assyrians were a harsh people. I don't remember which of the prophets it is that speaks against the Assyrians. One of the minor prophets that says, no one will be sad when you're gone. No one will mourn you. The Assyrians were a terrible people in many ways. All right. We move on, and he set out and went to Samaria. On the way, he was at Beth Eked of the shepherds. Jehu met the relatives of Ahaziah, king of Judah, and he said, "Who are you?" And they answered, "We are relatives of Ahaziah, and we came down to visit the royal princes and the sons of the queen mother." He said, "Take them alive." And they took them alive and slaughtered them at the pit of Beth Eked, 42 persons, and he spared none of them. Now, who was Ahaziah? Ahaziah was actually the grandson of Jezebel, right? Because he would have been the son of Jehoram, who married Athaliah, and so Ahaziah is, yeah. No, Jehoram ruled for 8 years, I believe. Oh, Ahaziah, yeah, Ahaziah was only for a year, and so he catches up with these people who are relatives of Ahaziah. And again, as part of this cleaning of Ahab's house, he takes care of them too. And when he departed from there, he met Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, coming to meet him. And he greeted him and said to him, "Is your heart true to my heart as mine is to yours?" And Jehonadab answered, "It is." Jehu said, "If it is, give me your hand." So he gave him his hand, and Jehu took him up into the chariot. And he said, "Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord." So he had him ride in his chariot. And when he came to Samaria, he struck down all who remained to Ahab in Samaria, till he had wiped them out according to the word of the Lord that he spoke to Elijah. Who's this Jehonadab guy? He's only in one other place in the Bible that we really find him. He's over in Jeremiah. That's exactly right. It's the same group mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 35, verses 5 through 19. I'm not going to read that for the sake of time, but he's the patriarch of this tribe. They call them the Rechabites. They're later commended by God for holding to the words that their forefather, Jehonadab, gave to them, instructions regarding how they should compose themselves, how they should live, what they can and can't drink. I can't tell from the context if they're necessarily Jewish, but according to Jewish tradition, they intermarried with the Levites. There's a promise over in Jeremiah chapter 35 that says that the Rechabites will not lack a man to stand before me. And so Jewish tradition has it that they intermarried with the Levites and served God as Levites later in their lives. But here's another of my favorite Jehu quotes in verse 16. "Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord." It's interesting. Who's he calling out to come bear witness? Why this guy? What's that? Okay, it appears that he's somebody of good character, well known apparently. So when the Rechabites later are commended, it's on the back of everybody kind of knows who this Jehonadab guy is. He's a well-known figure. He's well known to be a righteous man from appearances here. Now, God has given people throughout the Old Testament instructions on you go wipe out somebody thoroughly, right? How many times in the past has that happened? Did the Jews wipe out the Canaanites like they were supposed to? No. Did Saul wipe out the people the Amalekites, like he was supposed to? No. Jehu, on the other hand, is thorough. He gets everybody. He's not kidding about this come and see my zeal for the Lord bit. So he pulls up Jehonadab to be a witness. And it says he struck down all who remained from the house of Ahab in Samaria until he had annihilated his house. He went all out. He did not leave anybody alive. There was no, sparing the king or sparing this guy or, no. He was thorough. So, what's his next move? Well, if we go on and read in verses 18 through 27, then Jehu assembled all the people and said to them, Ahab served Baal a little, but Jehu will serve him much. Now therefore, call to me all the prophets of Baal, all his worshippers and all his priests. Let none be missing, for I have a great sacrifice to offer to Baal. Whoever is missing shall not live. But Jehu did it with cunning in order to destroy the worshippers of Baal. And Jehu ordered, sanctify a solemn assembly for Baal. So they proclaimed it. And Jehu sent throughout all Israel. And all the worshippers of Baal came, so there was not a man left who did not come. And they entered the house of Baal, and the house of Baal was filled from one end to the other. He said to him who was in charge of the wardrobe, bring out the vestments for all the worshippers of Baal. So he brought out the vestments for them. Then Jehu went into the house of Baal with Jehonadab, the son of Rechab. And he said to the worshippers of Baal, search and see there's no servant of the Lord here among you, but only the worshippers of Baal. And then they went in to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings. Now Jehu stationed 80 men outside and said, the man who allows any of those whom I give into your hands to escape shall forfeit his life. So as soon as he had made an end of the burnt offering, Jehu said to the guard and the officers, go in and strike them down. Let not a man escape. So when they put them to the sword, the guard and the officers cast them out and went into the inner room of the house of Baal, and they brought out the pillar that was in the house of Baal and burned it. And they demolished the pillar of Baal and demolished the house of Baal and made it a latrine to this day. Here's another one of my favorite Jehu quotes. Ahab served Baal a little, but Jehu will serve him much. If ever there was a trap, that somebody sets in the Bible, this one's always puts a smile on my face whenever I read this little section. How you can just see sort of the exaggerated nature of the promise that he's making here. Get everybody together. We're going to offer a great sacrifice to Baal. And he uses it as a ploy to wipe out the worshipers of Baal. But consider verse 23 for a moment. See that there are no servants of the Lord here among you. What's Jehu's idea of a servant of the Lord? Who's he thinking about? Okay, those who didn't bow the knee, sure. What kind of people are going to be not at this assembly that might have been at this assembly? Okay, I don't think anybody from the southern kingdom were there. So when he's talking about servants of the Lord, he's thinking about the northern Israelites. Were they servants of the Lord? No. There's a mindset that we can get into when we don't pay careful attention to all of God's words. Now, I want to note, Jehu is exceptionally zealous. And Jehu pays attention to some of what God says. But we're going to see later, he never gives up the practices of Rehoboam. He never gives up the calves that are at Dan and Beersheba. He never attempts to change the way the people in the north worship God. In fact, it's not until Hezekiah, who we're going to get to hopefully a little bit here, that changes. That Hezekiah attempts to bring the people in the northern kingdom back to God and the real way they ought to be worshiping God. But Jehu thinks of these people as servants of the Lord. Now, I bring that up because there's a mentality today where we throw around the word Christian without thinking about whether somebody is really a follower of Christ. And we talk about the Christian world and things of that nature, but I would assert that in large part, many of those people are not following Christ. They might be zealous for parts of the law or to the best of their knowledge, but for how many people is that knowledge incomplete? Or do they set aside just large swaths of things that they don't want to pay attention to? They don't give up the practices that they have grown up in order to serve God the way God wants to be served. And so here Jehu says, well, we're going to execute all the worshipers of Baal. See that there are no servants of the Lord here. And I think he's using it in the same way that we would say, let's make sure there's no Christians here. But he's using the term too broadly. And this book ends one of my favorite comments. Then they tore down the temple of Baal and made it a latrine, which it is to this day. That ended Baal worship in northern Israel, which is an interesting occurrence because Israel is going to be carried off into captivity after 4 generations of Jehu's sons, as God promised him, sit on the throne. But Hoshea is going to be the last king of Israel, and then Assyria in 722 BC is going to come in and destroy the northern kingdom and carry off most of the people there into exile and move another people in who later become the Samaritans that the Jews who return from exile then have to contend with. And we see them still contending with them in the time of Christ. Go ahead, Scott.
I just wanted to make a comment on what you just said a few minutes ago about Jehu. He is zealous for the Lord. He does wipe out Baal worship. He's seemingly trying to turn the people back to God, except he doesn't go all the way. He doesn't eliminate the golden calves and the practice of that. And we see here that, I mean, that's important to God. I mean, it does matter to God how we worship him. But the thing that I was thinking about is, and this is in light of your comments about Christians and what people claim, but we need to be careful that we don't fall into the trap to think that, I mean, sometimes we say, okay, churches of Christ started because of the Restoration movement, and we act like the Restoration movement was a one-time thing that happened somewhere in the late 1800s, started by Alexander Campbell, so on and so forth. And the reality is we always need to be in a state of trying to restore things back to God and to the worship. We've never got to the point where we can say, hey, we've got it all. I mean, and I think that Jehu, he seemingly returns things back, but he doesn't go all the way. Restoration is a continued practice of a heart seeking after God, and we need to realize that we need to always be on guard and trying to make sure that we're trying to restore things back to the pattern that God wants us to have.
I think that's a great lead into kind of the end conclusion here about Jehu in 2 Kings 10. It says, thus Jehu wiped out Baal from Israel, but Jehu did not turn aside from the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. That is, the golden calves that were in Bethel and Dan. And the Lord said to Jehu, because you have done well in carrying out what is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart, your sons to the fourth generation shall sit on the throne of Israel. But Jehu was not careful to walk in the law of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all his heart. He did not turn from the sins of Jeroboam, which he made Israel to sin. And in verse 32, we see the conclusion of that is that in those days the Lord began to cut off parts of Israel. So consider these two great contrasts. Jehu eliminated Baal worship from Israel, but didn't turn away from the golden calves. All right, that's number one. The second contrast, the Lord praises and rewards Jehu. You've done well in carrying out what is right in my sight, and have done to the house of Ahab all that was in my heart. And note that 4 generations of sons on the throne is the longest dynasty that Israel has. Jehu's dynasty is the last dynasty in Israel, and it's the longest running one that they get. That's it. But then it says Jehu was not careful to follow the instruction of the Lord God of Israel with all his heart. And that's what Scott was alluding to, that following God with all your heart. When we get to Hezekiah in just a few minutes, we won't have time to cover everything this week, but this week and next week, I want you to see the reforms that Hezekiah puts into place and all of the people that he tries to bring back to God. And we all saw that Jehoshaphat did that earlier. And it's an every generation thing. We all need to be constantly working to bring people back to God, to bring them to his ways, to follow God with all our heart, and make sure that we're being careful to follow his commands. Go ahead, Cole.
All right, I'm going to ask a question that may put you on the spot.
Sure.
But it's also just something I've been thinking about in light. I was going to say, I appreciate what you said about like just using the term Christian flippantly, and just I do agree with what you said about that, and including what Scott said. And I think sometimes we aren't careful enough about that. But that being said, I am also like hesitant to that in a sense of like, I don't know if I'm just going to walk up to somebody and be like, yeah, you're not a Christian. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's not like a real statement I would say to somebody, whether I believe it or not. And I don't know if it's my job to tell them that. I think I would just say my job is to do exactly what you just said about Jehu is, continually trying to do it. And I think to encourage others to do the same thing is where we need to be at. Would you agree with that? Or
I would say that somebody who is using the word Christian for themselves, who is who wants to take on the name of Christ and do that, that's a great jumping off point. That's a great starting point for a conversation with them. To say, you wear the name of Christ, you call yourself a Christian, a follower of Christ. Let's look at the things that he said. Let's be careful to follow the things that he did. It's a starting point. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, we have to be pretty careful. I remember Jim Henson saying, we need to be careful not to whittle on God's end of the stick on that. Christian is a noun. It's not an adjective. Nowhere in the Bible is Christian used as an adjective. It is a noun. It describes us.
That's a good and excellent point. So, to answer your question, I would never go tell somebody, you're not a real Christian, but I would invite them to have a conversation about what it means to be a Christian.
I guess also maybe to add to that, from what I also get from this is that it does matter what we do. And I think it's importantly stressed here, and to look at what God has to say, and that's what you were getting at. So
it matters not only what you do, but what really matters is that you're trying to keep everything. Jehu wasn't careful to keep everything. He was careful to keep some of what God said. In fact, he kept parts of what God said better than a lot of people that had come before him, didn't he? But, and that was a big but, he didn't ever get rid of the idolatry. He didn't turn from that. He didn't serve God with a whole heart. And that's something that we can only judge in ourselves, not for other people, what's in their heart and whether or not they are following God with a whole heart. But I think we do have a responsibility for ourselves. I'm going to wear the name of Christ, and I'm going to call myself a servant of the Lord, then I should serve the Lord wholly.
Yes, I completely agree. Because I guess the reason why this idea has come up when I study with people or something like that, it's like I'm zealous, right? That comes across, right? And then
Yes.
it's like,
Zeal often
then
comes
they
across.
choose to maybe ignore something like you say, but, well, that's where grace covers me, or, that's usually how it's given to me, right? And like when it's said to me, and it's such a hard thing to, and I think that's where it goes back to like what you were saying. It's like, well, then at some point, those people like who may say that or not, you just have to present the truth and what you believe the truth is, and it's their job to either accept what God's saying or not, right? Because I guess that's what
exactly
he chose
right.
not to do, is he chose not to accept some piece of it, or so.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. Go ahead. I've got Kyle here.
You read the standard in verse 31
Yes.
on what Jehu did not carefully and wholeheartedly obey the law. And that's what the Jews ultimately became. They claimed to be followers of the law, but the only thing they really followed were their traditions, the one they wanted to do. And so a lot of people are Christians by tradition and not by obedience. And I mean that in the sense of the world that claims themselves to be Christians.
I think as people who are in the Church of Christ, we also need to make sure that we are not Christians according to tradition. We need to be Christians who are following God's law and keeping his commands. I won't trouble you with, what are those commands, but everybody ought to know the three great ones, right? If I asked you, what are the three greatest commandments? Okay? Your neighbor is yourself, and he gave his disciples, he gave them a new commandment: love each other. So we understand those things, and if we're not following those commands with a whole heart, then we probably aren't serving God the way he wants to be served. I have one more point. In Hosea chapter 1, verses 4 and 5, the Lord said to him, that is Hosea, call his name Jezreel, for in just a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. And on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Not entirely sure what to make of this, but there's something off about Jehu and how he handled things in Jezreel. And it could be as simple as God's overall view of killing. David was not allowed to build the temple because he was a man of blood, okay? Those who live by the sword will also perish by the sword, is what Jesus tells Peter. So God has a not favorable view of those who live by the sword. And the picture we get of Jehu is of a violent man, and maybe he was too violent. God condemns the Babylonians in a similar way over in Jeremiah chapter 50 and 51. He says, I called you to action against Judah, and then you went in and you were so much worse than you had to be, essentially. Paraphrasing that. Babylon was evil in how they carried it out, and so God punishes Babylon for what they did. All right, let's get to our thought questions real fast. What can I learn from the reign of King Jehu? What are some lessons for me to take away? Go ahead, Rachel.
So I have written next to this story of Jehu, and it's not my thought, but I think that this is just important for us. Jehu served God when it fit his ideology He was a great warrior. He hated Ahab's family. So that was easy for him to follow, right? God said, go and destroy. Jehu says, I've got this. I know how to do this. But when it didn't fit his ideology, he didn't serve God. So it wasn't important to him to end to take away the golden calves. And so just after that, I have attitude behind action is important. And I think that's where Hosea 1:4 comes in, is Jehu's attitude. He was zealous of the things he wanted to be zealous about. God needed him to be zealous about the things that were important to God. And that was part of it. Jehu did part of it, but he didn't fully love God and serve God.
Apparently, you and I learned the same lessons, because those were my 2 points also. Agreed. Go ahead, Phil.
Well, I want to bring us back to the end of verse 31, with all his heart.
Yep.
Because no amount of action, however zealous and however you think God approves of it, you're not going to pull the wool over his eyes about your heart.
Yeah, and so to that point, do you know people that can quote Scripture, have memorized parts of the Bible, and yet seem to have some very strong views on things that don't fit what God wants? Or who perhaps have some problems with things that God says? Go ahead, Brother Jackson.
I guess I see it a little bit different in the fact that I always thought of Jehu as a politician. He had the choice of Baal, or he has the choice of, I hate to say God, because I don't think it's God, whatever you want to call
I understand.
their religion.
Yeah.
And he didn't like you said, so he took the political side and went after all of the Baal worshipers, and he turned the rest of the country into what he thought was going to be following his definition of God. But I think it was all politics.
Then do we need to be careful when we are choosing our leaders if they are claiming to serve God in one capacity but completely ignoring him in many other ways? Because that's a thing that happens, right? We have people who claim to be for various godly things and yet do not serve God with a whole heart, very obviously, in their lives. We've got a lot of Jehus running around right now. Hard to find one that's not, perhaps. All right, what do I learn about God from, here's another slide, by the way, of Jehu being forced to kneel before Sennacherib. Is it Shalmaneser, sorry. What do I learn about God from the reign of King Jehu? Oh, sorry, go ahead. Who have I got over there? Oh, Trish.
I have struggled the last few weeks in this class because of the, I guess, positive things that have been said about Jehu, whereas in other areas of the Bible we're told that if we miss in one dot and tittle, then we've missed it all. But I finally came to the conclusion tonight, as evil in as many ways as he was, God saw something in him that was worth sparing him.
It's true.
And so if God saw that, it doesn't matter whether I see it or not, or if I agree that he should have been spared from all the punishment. God thought he had some redeeming value that maybe I just can't see.
I was mistaken. We are not going to start Hezekiah tonight. But you're right. And that's one of my points here, is that God is pleased when we obey him. God is pleased that Jehu carries out his commands. It's just that he's not pleased that Jehu doesn't carry out all of his commands. And God is not pleased when we obey him in ways that cause or perpetuate needless suffering. Jehu never uses a scalpel to cut out a problem when he can run over it with a chariot. He's a blunt instrument, but God uses him to do good and serve a purpose. So, you can be not a great person and still serve God's purposes, is another one of my takeaways from it. I saw another hand back over. Gary, did you? Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. And so Jehu was the person that God needed to carry out those commands. He was the right person at the right time to do what needed to be done to clean up the mess that Ahab had left. And to that end, Assyria was the rod of God's anger. All right, I've got 1 minute left. So in that time, I'm going to tell you, please, next week, if you don't have the reading, I can print you off more copies of this on Sunday, but do the reading so that we don't have to read as much in class, and we'll get to Hezekiah. There's a lot to Hezekiah, but here are the things I want you to pay attention to. In 2 Kings 18, I want you to pay attention to it's going to talk in verses 1 through 7. It's going to talk about the things, kind of a general overview of his reign. I want you to look at 2 Chronicles chapter 29. Okay, we're going to talk about the rebuilding of the temple and the various things that were done. And then in chapter 30, we're going to look at the Passover being kept and the things that happened around that. So we're going to talk about the preparation and then the observation and their joy in serving God. And then we're going to look in later years at the invasion of Israel, which happened in Hezekiah's day. In his 6th year was when Samaria was captured by Sargon II. The Assyrian invasion, and then into Judah. So in the 14th year, Sennacherib starts capturing the various cities in Judah. And we have Hezekiah's prayer where he appeals to God for help. And then we'll last look at his illness, his delivery from death, the sign that's given to him, and the visit from the Babylonian officials that's talked about in 2 Chronicles and in Isaiah. So those are the things that I want to cover next week, and hopefully we'll have time to get through all that and still have time to talk a little bit about Manasseh, who is, I think, the poster child for the power of God's word to change people. All right. Any other questions or comments? I thank you all